Very bad connection on my side. I don't know why. Today is very bad connection.
Maybe you have to add some router, Pak. This is happen in my home. I add in every room.
I put a router.
As to strengthen. Okay. So we try to divide it into 3 or 4 router at home. Otherwise, we cannot do so. Yeah, this online working. Maybe you have to add some router, but this is happen in my home. I add in every room.
I put a router.
As to strengthen. Okay. So we try to divide it into 3 or 4 router at home. Otherwise, we cannot do so. Yeah, this online working. How come my voice is echoing?
You have two devices.
I only have one. What happened?
Hello, Larry.
Hello. Hi, how are you, Derek? Yeah.
How is going on there after the storm?
Well, the East Coast storm was not big. The one that's big is the one that hit this morning in Louisiana and Texas. There's a big hurricane. We had an inconvenience. They have a big problem, I think, starting now in the Gulf Coast. One of the worst, but I don't know that it's hitting a city. But we're fine. New England has it pretty easy.
Yeah, that's not convenient, but yeah, it's good to hear everything is well.
Yeah, one thing about the United States, like Indonesia, one part of the country can have a disaster and the other can be a beautiful sunny day. And California has wildfires, and Texas and Louisiana have a hurricane coming, and it could be a beautiful late summer day in much of the rest of the country.
And may I ask you a question, Professor?
Sure.
Like how the COVID-19 itself impact the life of the university in MIT, because like in Oxford or Cambridge, they are closing the student admission. Like is it happening in MIT as well?
So it's been very interesting to watch. I've been pretty much every day on committees that have been discussing this kind of question. And what MIT decided to do was allow graduate students to come back to keep up much of the research programs, and only a very small percentage of the undergraduates, so that there are some on-campus dormitories, but they're occupied at a very low level. So only one person per room, and they're trying to do a large amount of testing. Every person who's on the campus has a test 2 times per week, and they have a separate dormitory if someone gets available, if someone gets sick but not terribly sick. And so the plan is to have some people back on campus, but even with that, most of the classes are being offered remotely only. My department, for instance, is not doing any in-person classes, even if there are some students who are on or near the campus. So it feels extremely different, but there's fortunately a very good medical facility right nearby, and the capacity to do a tremendous amount of testing. We heard yesterday that MIT campus alone does 10% of the testing in all of Massachusetts. So a state with millions and millions of people, the place that is paying most close attention to testing people regularly is actually my own campus.
Surely.
But it's been very disruptive, but the hope is, and we'll know more when classes start Tuesday next week. We'll see how it goes.
Oh, so there has there hasn't been any class because it's not yet start.
It hasn't yet started, but over the last 2 or 3 months, there's been a gradual ramp up of some of the research activities, the laboratory research, for instance, and so there were lots of new protocols about how many people would be allowed in at any one time, and they developed an app that people can have on their phones that will where you have to report your health status every day, and then you go to a trailer for a test every 3 or 4 days, and as long as that is negative, and as long as you're on the list of people who are allowed to go into the buildings, then you can come in. But for most people, most of the staff, most of the faculty, the idea has been to do what you can from home and to not come to campus unless you really need to. So that's my plan.
How about the online class? The online class conducted, is it like real-time cloud meeting style, or video making, or any kind of policy? How the lecturer has to conduct the lecture?
It's very highly varied. You know, we had to do this quickly in March. In the middle of our last semester, everyone had to, in a week, switch over to only remote teaching, and everybody was, or almost everybody, departed the campus. And my teaching switched to synchronous video events, much like we're doing today.
Just like the seminar.
Yeah. And but other people recorded certain things in advance. I think it was much harder for classes that are more discussion based, and then once people departed, some of them moved into very different time zones. You know, so I was in Massachusetts, but I had a student in India, and we had to figure out how to deal with the fact that she was 9.5 hours off from my time zone, and a lot of logistical problems like that were there. And then, of course, the challenge of how high quality the bandwidth was, because not everyone was going to a situation where they could access the internet adequately to do things, and that's been a big challenge as well. But there's been an attempt to try and help people who are in difficult situations. And even the people who have the worst situation, either at home or with their technology, have been invited back to the campus to live on the campus if they have a high priority need to do that.
So basically, yeah.
Yes, sorry, Mr. Lee. And how about the optimist forecast from MIT regarding this COVID-19? Like, what do you think about this? Like when is it going to be stopped? You know, like, yeah, it's been like 6 months.
Yeah, I don't know. You get the people that really are involved in a lot of the vaccine development and things like that. I haven't heard from them recently, you know, but when I did, you know, you got a lot of different answers. And I think there are a lot of people that feel like we will have not a sudden end, but a long period of uncertainty where even once there is a vaccine or other treatments, they won't be as widely spread. And for people, you know, in a world where people travel everywhere, it's not an easy thing to eradicate, but hopefully we'll get to a point where some parts of movement will resume. But you know, the plan is to wait and see what things will be like when 2021 begins. I'm on one committee that's called Task Force 2021 Plus, which is supposed to be thinking of all the good ideas that we can develop now to implement when this is over. And I think that 2021 Plus is a bit of a mystery. You know, is it really going to be 2021 or some future year? We'll have to see.
Just crossing our finger, hoping for the best.
That's right.
Okay, Mr. Bli.
Pak Aswin, bisa dimulai?
Yeah, we will have maybe another 5 minutes, Professor Haryo, to admit the rest of the participants that already in the waiting room.
Okay.
So we already have here Professor Tommy Firman, our Dean, Ibu Sri Mariati, Professor Haryo, Pak Delik, and also some lecturers from School of Architecture, Planning, and Policy Development.
Good morning, Professor Phil.
Good morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time and effort to give a lecture to in our school.
I'm very happy, Dean. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Larry.
Hi, Tommy.
How are you?
Good to see you.
Good morning.
Very well. Yeah.
Yeah.
You have some
nice
great
to have you
photographs.
here. It's nice to have you here in Bandung.
Thank you. This is as close as I can get right now.
I think everyone has been admitted, sir.
Oh,
I think if you may, you want to start.
Okay. Bu Sri, Pak Haryo, bisa kita mulai?
Yeah, please.
Yes, Professor Phil, we are about to start our lecture now. Let me speak in Bahasa first to greet our participant. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat sore and good morning to Professor Larry Phil that already among us as the first or start of our program on Sustainable Development Goals Seminar Series. So we already have Ibu Sri Mariati, Dean of SAPPK, School of Architecture, Planning and Policy Development. We already have Professor Haryo Winarso, our moderator. Before we begin, I would like to read down our rundown. So we begin with introduction of the program by me from the SAPPK, and followed by introduction of the lecture and guest lecturer by the Dean of SAPPK and also the moderator. In 7 o'clock, we will start our lecture by Professor Lawrence Vail, about 45 minutes, and then followed by question and answer led by the moderator, about 30 minutes, and then closing by moderator. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our Dean, Ibu Sri Mariati, to give the introduction of the lecture and also guest lecturer. Please, Ibu Sri Mariati.
Yes, thank you, Pak Aswin. Distinguished Professor Phil, distinguished all of the participants of this lecture, good morning and good evening. Sustainable development goals are global goals to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. There are 17 goals in SDGs, including the goals 11, namely sustainable cities and communities. Specifically, this goal would like to make cities and human settlement inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. The goal 11 is the most related goal to the built environment, that is the focus of exploration at our school, School of Architecture, Planning, and Policy Development. Making cities sustainable means creating business and economic opportunities, safe and affordable housing, and building resilient societies, creating good infrastructure and public spaces, and improving urban planning and management in participatory and inclusive ways. The goals of the SDGs 11 are closely related to the urbanization process. It is projected that 60% of the world population will live in cities by 2030. With a big urban population and various economic activities in the cities, cities or urban areas are very important contributors to economic growth. However, urban areas are also major contributors to the environmental problem. Other problems in urban area are housing and informal settlement issues, as well as access to infrastructure and basic services. The COVID-19 pandemic that we currently facing now, so us also the problem of urban health, especially in densely populated areas. Indonesia has committed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. 10 years remaining to achieve this goal, and then Indonesian government has set various targets related to SDGs 11, including zero settlement and 100% access to water and sanitation and other infrastructure. To achieve this goal, we believe that universities are the central element. Universities are placed to do research and education for national leaders who will determine the direction of this nation development. Our lecture today from Professor Lauren Vale is the first lecture or inaugural lecture in this semester, and also the first lecture in online seminar series with the big theme, Sustainable Development Goals. On this occasion, I would like to express our gratitude and appreciation to Professor Vale for the time and valuable talks on the SDGs 11. This event will be moderated by Professor Haryo Minarso. Professor Haryo is the head of research cluster of urban planning and design in School of Architecture Planning and Policy Department, Institut Teknologi Bandung. Also chairman of the Senate of the school, and also Professor Haryo has served as education and culture attaché in the United States previously, and currently has research also with MIT with Professor Lawrence Vale, and in ITB also Professor Tommy Firman and Deli Kudala involved in this research team. Yes, for further this lecture, I will pass this lecture to Professor Haryo Minarso to moderate this event, and also to introduce Professor Lauren Vale. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sri Mariati, our Dean, our beloved Dean. Yes, we are very happy now that we can have Professor Lawrence Vale here. And actually, Professor Lawrence Vale and Professor Pisahap Sanyal, also with Professor Tommy Firman and Dr. Deli Kudala, we are, and also the other, Niken and other, we are actually starting research collaboration within the MIT Indonesian Research Alliance, and this way I'm very happy that we can again meet with Professor Larry Vale. Professor Larry Vale is an associate dean and fourth professor of urban design and planning at MIT. He was the head of Department of Urban Studies and Planning from 2002 until 2009, and he taught in MIT in the School of Architecture and Planning since 1988. Now, Professor Vale is the head of the director of the Resilient Cities Housing Initiative, a unit in the School of Center for Advanced Urbanism. He was also president of Society for American City and Regional Planning History. Professor Phil held degrees from Amherst College and then with summa cum laude, MIT in Arts and University of Oxford, Doctor of Philosophy. I think that is the important thing, and Professor Phil has been published a lot of book and work has been on the a lot of city history, politics, and design of American public housing, and include books from the Puritan to the project, public housing and public neighborhood. And I think there's many publications that Professor Phil has been made. We are now happy, Professor Phil, that actually this is also the first, well, no, it's the second, the third days of our beginning semester. So it's your lecture will be the opening lecture for all. And like you have seen, the participant here is almost more than 100, I think, around 100. And also they are in the YouTube streaming, live streaming. And of course, this mostly from the graduate studies in ITB, master degree and doctoral degree. And also there's invitation for government official, I think, from Jakarta. And there's, I can see some also student, well, our network from other university and even from university in the United States. I think without further ado, I would like to ask Professor Phil to start the presentation on this occasion, and the title will be From the Resilient City to the Equitable Resilient City. Please, the time is yours, Professor Phil.
Thank you so much. I'm really most grateful for this invitation from the Dean to join you tonight and for this introduction from Professor Harjo. I've not been to Bandung in person, although I have come as close as Jakarta about 6 years ago. And more broadly, I would just say that I have a special fondness for a long time for Indonesia, ever since my wife and I visited 4 Indonesian islands during our 2-month honeymoon more than 30 years ago. And so although I cannot share a visit with you in person at this time, let me at least offer to share my screen.
Yes, please continue,
And
Professor Phil.
we will.
Yeah.
Okay. We can see that now, right?
Yeah.
Good. So I'm really pleased to hear a little bit about your country's commitment to pursuing the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. I think, like a lot of us in the fields of urban planning and design, I was really happy that this 11th goal shown here was included as a prominent part of the 17 pieces in the SDG framework. This challenge of what's been given the shorthand sustainable cities and communities really does seem absolutely central to the SDGs. The UN's diagnosis of the problems as really what amounts to rapid urbanization, energy waste, and disaster vulnerability all happening at once seems apt. That's what's shown in the cartoon style things at the top of the screen there. This is what, bringing those things together is what makes cities so central to the questions of sustainability. But at the same time, the SDG 11 is a really large task. And I think it's one that reveals a kind of contradiction. If we look at each word in that phrase, sustainable cities and communities, each one of those is a difficult and imprecise term. Sustainability runs the risk of suggesting that there's some single future state that works for all, or even worse, that some destructive practices could continue under the guise of greenwashing. And then there's cities. Cities is also a problematic term. It risks being too small on the one hand, in other words, failing to embrace rural areas or a larger city region, but it also risks being too large in that it could fail to differentiate among the many subunits of cities which may experience very different conditions within the same city. And then that makes it very difficult to think of an entire city as sustainable. Adding the word communities to the terminology directly helps address that problem, of course, but then that raises the question of which communities matter and at what scale. So if the three terms, sustainable, cities, communities, are problematic, what does that leave us with? It leaves us with the word and. And might be a pretty good choice of word because it correctly suggests that SDG 11 is concerned with all, with everything, with everyone. That's appropriate and it's admirable, but it also makes it too easy to avoid talking about the trade-offs that we have, the choices, the priorities that do get made. Whose city and whose community is it that actually matters most when there's so many? Framed differently, you know, what does it mean to achieve the SDG cities for all? Now, let's see why. Let's see if we can. It's. We need to be able to move this. The screen. Let's see. All right, there, sorry. So SDG 11 is providing aspirational targets. That's the word that gets used for most things that affect cities and human settlements. You know, there are targets. If you looked at all of these things up there on the screen, the shorthand would be targets for housing, for transport, for urbanization, heritage, disaster planning, environment, public space, regional planning, holistic kinds of planning, and buildings. And some of them are listed with dates that are 10 years out still from now, but one of them, the one down at 11B, that talks about the need for holistic disaster risk management, wanted cities and human settlements to have made progress by 2020. So here we are in 2020 with new disasters, especially COVID-19, coming just in time to make things much more difficult. And so as SDG 11 gets addressed in various places around the world, the shorthand idea of sustainable cities and communities, which seems so straightforward and non-controversial, gets much more politically complicated, especially when you add terms like inclusive, safe, and resilient. I'm particularly interested in this last term, resilience, especially since it connects to disaster risk reduction and to all of the other SDG target areas that are threatened by climate change and by the spread of COVID-19 into densely urbanized places. So in this context, a word like sustainability really doesn't quite seem up to the task. So what follows, I want to explain why resilience, if it's defined in a careful way that includes distributional politics, may be a way to help the SDG 11 targets be more likely to be really inclusive. So if we're trying to make cities and human settlements inclusive and safe and resilient and sustainable, I think this means we cannot shy away from talking about the politics of resilience. Politics, it seems, inevitably enters into the resilience discussion at many levels, precisely because resilience entails making financial choices and setting priorities for what and for who receives funds. Making progress on resilience entails spending a lot of money, and that means it's not easy to understand as something we too casually term cities or even human settlements. In many ways, the shorthand of city, as I've said, could just be the wrong scale. What social scientists would call the wrong unit of analysis. The challenge is bigger, understanding the structure and governance in a city region, and smaller, understanding the differently situated positions of neighborhoods within cities, which have different levels of wealth and power. So to the extent that we engage in the politics of resilience, it can't just be about finding instrumental ways to get things done in difficult bureaucracies. That's part of the challenge, but it's also about paying attention to the social equity dimensions of resilience. So in the remainder of my time, here's where I'm headed. I want to say something about the politics of defining resilience and resilient cities. Then I'll show how this helps us model disaster recovery in a more socially complex way. That I think means paying closer attention to what I like to call design politics with a hyphen in it. Ways that demonstrate how politics colors what gets built and for whom and with what meaning. Then I'll say just a little bit about how I've tried to operationalize this through the work of MIT's Resilient Cities Housing Initiatives, and then briefly apply it to understanding some of the approaches undertaken in Aceh province following the 2004 earthquake and tsunami, as well as something about some new approaches emerging from the World Bank. And finally, I'll conclude by explaining what I see as the key difference between a resilient city and one that is also an equitably resilient city. When the so if we start by this kind of definition about whose resilience matters, I think that's a really important question in this politics. So when one looks at this definition, it's really a little bit problematic. The definition that you see here, which is the one used by the Rockefeller Foundation and then becomes part of the 100 Resilient Cities program, seems perfectly clear and decent, but it's also really evasive. Its authors seem to realize that evasion right in the definition where the parentheses start, and they realize they have to define what a city is. It's completely fair to see cities as constituting individuals, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems. That's a pretty good list, but those aren't just components of cities. They're also points of view. They're lenses through which resilience might actually be seen. And when we're looking through lenses, not everybody sees the same thing. Some are nearsighted and see only what's closest to themselves and their own interests, and others are farsighted, good at seeing into the distance, but at the expense of reading what is closest at hand. Will those who see the city as a particularly situated individual see the city in the same way as someone who is looking at diagrams of infrastructure systems? Will communities judge resilience priorities in the same way as businesses will? So when you have a disaster, or even when planning to reduce the impact of a future disaster, people talk often in engineering kinds of terms about resilience, the notion of bounce back, a physical recovery of the built environment and restoration of the environment, this notion of rebuilding. But then there are economists that will equally plausibly talk about resilience in terms of economic recovery, a return to some stage of pre-disaster normalcy, expressed by economic output or a return of tourism, that kind of thing. But resilience is really multifaceted, and above all, it's rooted in the human capacity to withstand traumatic events, what you might call emotional restoration. The photos here are taken in the aftermath of the 2005 destruction that followed Katrina in New Orleans, and it shows a home rebuilding task, tourism resumption in the famous French Quarter, and the very personal capacity of a hair care professional to cope with her flooded shop. you know, if you take these together, I think that's kind of what I mean by a much more holistic view of resilience. If we look at this more holistic view, then we have questions about whose resilience matters most, which parts of cities matters most, who's going to benefit the most from investment, especially in a kind of post-disaster context, who's going to gain less or even be hurt by efforts taken in the name of resilience. So I've been puzzling over this for a while, most of the last 2 decades, dating back to a colloquium that I organized in 2002 following the 9/11 terrorist attacks that hit New York and Washington, D.C. And we called the colloquium originally the Resilient City, Trauma, Recovery, and Remembrance. That's the ruins of the World Trade Center there on the left. And together with my colleague Tom Campanella, we wanted to explore how governments and people of other cities had responded to complex forms of sudden disaster, whether attacks or earthquakes or major storms or wars, all sorts of things. The book that we did, called The Resilient City, How Modern Cities Recover from Disaster, came out on the exact date of the Indian Ocean tsunami, December 26, 2004. And then it got to bookstores right in time for Hurricane Katrina to hit the US Gulf Coast the following summer. And so I don't claim that I or this book coined the term resilient city, but it was the start of a big trend made by lots of people to link the terms resilient and city together in the title of books. I've counted well over a dozen lately. There are also guides to good practices and ways of organizing frameworks for action plans, and even a book about the role of libraries, public libraries and resilient cities that was edited by someone who is both a planner and a librarian. A nice combination, I think. And then various academic conferences and NGOs started picking up the term, notably the ICLEI, the Local Governments for Sustainability. It was the theme for a joint conference of the North American, European, and European planning schools. And then the foundations jumped on this. MacArthur had resilient regions. Rockefeller sponsored the 100 Resilient Cities projects. And then the UN and the World Bank all started embracing this term. It's not just the books and the reports and the conferences and formal initiatives, it's also articles. Someone did an article looking at this term urban resilience and resilient city in the Web of Science database from 1998 to 2014. And you can see that it's gone up rapidly. I haven't seen whether it started a trend down. I tried it on Google Trends as of up through April of 2018, and you can see that it was gaining ground all over that. I also tried mapping it opposite the term sustainability, which of course has a bigger following, but the trend seems slightly downward on sustainability and continuously upward on resilience. So that's just the global mentions of resilience in blue and sustainability in red. So who knows, there's something. But there's also really an interesting phenomenon that people mean so many different things when they use this term. It's sometimes urban security or counterterrorism, sometimes it's economic growth or employment or supply chain management or building technology to withstand physical threats. Or it could be about particular institutions that serve neighborhoods, enhancing strong communities, disaster response, infrastructure. It either suggests that resilience is just excessively malleable as a term that give widely divergent discussions about cities that have nothing to do with one another, or that if you pair resilient and city together, it usefully recognizes connections among subjects that really ought to be considered together. And I think perhaps it's actually some, or maybe even a lot of each of those. The talk is often about cities, but the locus of resilience varies at all sorts of different scales. each scale one chooses comes up with a different politics. The scale of the city is probably somewhere in the middle of the range, as I've illustrated here. And each one of these place levels has a different kind of structure of governance. It has different institutions in charge, different stakeholders, different budgetary processes. Every spatial lens we choose has a different balance of power among the private sector, the public sector, the nonprofit or civil society sector, and communities of citizens. So it's really complicated. And this is why people from so many different fields have jumped to this. And you know, my hope is that we can embrace the range of disciplines that are doing it and try and figure out whether there are ways that they can come together rather than just talk past each other using the same word. I did a chapter recently in the Cities Reader that was called Resilient Cities, Clarifying Concept or Catch-all Cliche. And my hope is that it still can be a clarifying concept if we're able to embrace the virtue as a concept that reveals important interconnections between environmental forces and social institutions. But if we do that, we can't shy away from confronting its capacity to open windows into a society's structure of political power. This is the kind of thing that I think was meant by the person who stuck this sheet on a pole in New Orleans. It says, "Stop calling me resilient," because every time you say, "Oh, they're resilient," that means you can do something else to me. I am not resilient. It's from the Louisiana Justice Institute. So what's going on there is people saying, well, maybe if you start telling people how resilient they are, it means that the government and the people with larger budgets don't need to help. And it's what yielded a kind of backlash, a kind of neoliberal backlash to the term. I think this quote from a recent book by Ashley Dawson called Extreme Cities gets at this thing. You know, that it's used for elites and it's shunting the responsibility to adapt a hazard onto individuals. It's disaggregating society into isolated survivalists, and it's become a dominant jargon for addressing the manifold crises of the extreme city without doing anything to get at the root causes of these things. So that's a tough set of critique, and I think there's something to it. But I think it just behooves us to really go back further and try and think, if we take this more holistic view of resilience that all of these fields want us to consider together, we can then ask the tough question about whose resilience matters most, which part of cities matters most, who's going to benefit most from investment, especially if there's been a disaster already, and who's going to gain less or even be hurt if there are efforts undertaken in the name of resilience. This comes together when people think about how do you model what it means to recover from a disaster, because what the variables that we think to measure and the things we forget to measure matter a lot. So 40 years ago, there's this famous, or more than 40 years ago, there was this famous model that was developed by the National Science Foundation in the United States, looking at both North America and Latin America to model what urban recovery would look like. And so they identify these phases where the first phase is 10 times, the second phase is 10 times longer than the first phase, and then the other one is 10 times beyond that second one. And so when you put it on a logarithmic chart, it means essentially that if there's a disaster that takes an emergency phase of 1 week, it'll be 10 weeks of restoration to return to function, 100 weeks to get to the first phase of replacement rebuilding. So it's like 2 years, and then maybe 5 or 10 years to really build out formally. So they've kind of matched what this would look like, but you know, what it misses is that the way that built environment affects resilience much more than that. They looked at a lot of examples. They looked at historic examples like San Francisco in 1906, where there was the famous earthquake and 3 days of fires that destroyed 28,000 buildings and made hundreds of thousands of people homeless. And even though the famous planner Daniel Burnham had planned, the plan that you see in the bottom right is not the 1907 plan, it's the 1905 plan. In other words, a year before the disaster, Burnham had already figured out a plan for improving parts of the city, and then very little of it actually got built because people owned property and contested what was going to happen. You can see he's not looking very happy there. But the recovery model, mapped it out pretty well. This is San Francisco applying those categories of emergency restoration, Reconstruction 1 and Reconstruction 2 over a 20-year period. But it misses a lot of things. What we're building is not simply the things in that chart. We're building our stories, our symbols, and our politics. I think often we ask these rather vague kind of questions. Has New Orleans recovered from Katrina? Will Port-au-Prince in Haiti recover from the 2010 earthquake? And what we sometimes forget is that's buried in this are assumptions like really a kind of triply contestable set of terms and assumptions. Has something that we call a city embarked on something that we can characterize as recovery from something that we can consider to be a disaster? And so what I want to do when I stress the importance of thinking through this resilient city as a concept is to really stress what is meant by resilient and city. Who counts as the city? Who decides who counts as the city? How do we measure recovery? How do we name and frame the disaster that occurred, given that the way it's named and framed may affect what actually allows blame to happen. And so I think of it as something that really is a kind of link between resilience and the built environment in multiple ways. It's examining these places. It's trying to figure out, as we did with the Resilient Cities project, that many different constituencies defined recovery differently and prioritize readiness for future threats in different ways. But there were still common tactics and strategies and resilience-seeking behavior. But the city leaders were always trying to figure out three kinds of constructed acts. How do you manage the dominant narrative about the state of recovery? In other words, who gets to tell the story, the narrative meaning? How does that get framed? What are the initiatives to highlight conspicuous symbolic milestones of recovery? In other words, which projects will signal a comeback? And then third, what are the attempts to negotiate and control the politics of redevelopment? Who's going to benefit from the available funding? So despite the differentiated landscape of urban recovery, we frequently ignore the more obvious kinds of clues about the narrative voice or lack thereof, the architectural symbolism and the political favoritism. In terms of these narratives, it was very interesting to see a book that came out 20 years or so ago that was called The Unfinished Bombing, about the destruction of a federal building in Oklahoma in the United States, where Ed Linenthal, the author, described the ways that people talk about a disaster and the need of government and people in charge to constantly say, things are going to get better, we're going to build back better. It's a kind of narrative of progress. And then there were a second kind of ideas where what Linenthal calls narratives of redemption. In other words, that people had been tested by God and are now able to move forward, having learned something, whether it's the lone mosque that survives the tsunami, like you see in the picture on the far left, or the temporary church in Mississippi after Katrina, where it says Katrina was big, but God is bigger. And then there was this third kind of thing that that governments are determined doesn't become dominant, what Linenthal called the toxic narrative. In other words, to recognize that this are life-changing traumatic events for people that they simply cannot and do not get over. And so the rhetoric behind resilience is to make sure that people either see it through the lens of progress or through the lens of redemption, and do not dwell on this inevitable problem that will be with them forever. And then there's the symbolic side, the symbolism of disasters and recovery. Is one example that is particularly striking to me was Warsaw in Poland, where the Nazis destroyed 80% of the city in the Second World War, and there were 800,000 people that died during that war. And then the Nazis completely systematically tore down the city. And then the Poles rebuilt it in important ways. As you can see at the bottom is the rebuilt city of the old part of Warsaw. And then not only that, they realized that before the war, there had been a traffic problem entering the old part of the city. And so they tunneled under the old part of the city when they did the rebuilding. So there's a pre-war picture on the top right and a post-war in the bottom. They very cleverly relied on 18th century paintings to document what had been there before the Nazis had destroyed it, because the Nazis had insisted otherwise on tearing up all the drawings that might have existed. The same kind of thing happened, I think, in terms of prioritizing symbols and forward-looking kinds of things in New York, where, you know, within a month or so after the World Trade Center was torn down, people were saying, well, of the many things we can do is we can build better plaza and fix the transportation, regional transportation hub that was there. And then the fancy station from Calatrava was commissioned to try and do it. So this kind of opportunism and opportunity for transportation in those two cases, the priority that was given to demonstrating something positive that could happen even after a terrible disaster, I think is something that's really important. The third of these is what I call the politics of Reconstruction, and just how much the political system in every country matters to what is actually built and for whom and how. In 1976, there was the enormous destruction of the city of Tangshan in northeast China. The government admitted to about 250,000 deaths. Many scholars think it may have been even double that. You know, in other words, one of the single largest losses of life ever. And yet, within 10 years, Tangshan was built back up to its original population of about 1 million, because there was a command economy that directed certain kinds of things from every province to contribute to it. And it was a priority for the industrial economy of Northeast China. That was something that they could do in a situation like that. Mexico City had an enormous earthquake, not the same death toll, but the 1985 earthquake that hit disproportionately in the center of the downtown area, and in some cases literally revealed the working conditions of sweatshops and dangerous conditions. There were terrible stories about owners rushing in to recover machinery rather than bodies of people who had been killed in the earthquake. And it caused huge amounts of pushback politically And within a few years, what had been a one-party state was overturned, both nationally and in Mexico City itself, and changed the politics once people pushed back for the restoration of affordable housing in the center part of the city. The second earthquake that hit Mexico City, and even more hard in some of the areas nearby, the headline here, from this article, it exposes Mexico's deep inequality. And that's what's happened with disasters as well as pre-disasters, is that you get this situation where people have a window into the inequalities that existed right before the disaster struck. So it's like this opportunity to see what had happened. After the Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, for instance, the New York Times put together an explanation of, why is it that there were so many Black people in the city that were behind? And they began by looking at the number of people in poverty. The list at the top here are all the Black versus white living in poverty. And then they looked at which people had cars, shown with the darker symbol here, and which, again, of the households in poverty who had no car. And the largest were households in poverty with no car. And at a time when there was not adequate public transportation, it helped explain why is it that the poorest households and the disproportionately Black and African-American households were the ones that were behind. As usual, I think the press can make it even worse. These were two famous examples in the United States where there were similar looking photos where the top one is showing a person of color wading through water, and it says after looting a grocery store. And then a similar looking photo that is showing white people is describing them as finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. In other words, just the language that was racialized to suggest that if it's a Black person, they're looting, and if it's a white person, they're finding. It's sort of what the cartoonist really gets best. When the water recedes, what is left are revealed inequalities along race and class and other kinds of lines. This, I think, is a pretty generalizable thing. So what we've tried to do in the Resilient Cities Housing Initiative is to think about how one develops and redevelops housing environments for the least advantaged. And we focused on not just making housing affordable, but looking for examples that do these 4 other things. Because if the housing is going to be really useful, it has to support community structure. It has to be in line with the possibility of sustaining or building kinds of economic livelihoods. It has to really help people cope with these other challenges: the economic struggle, the changing climate, the dysfunctional governance, the urban violence. So the shorthand that we gave them, livelihood, environment, governance, and security, was really trying to say, beyond helping people with affordable housing, how does it really help people in their communities? So how is housing sited with access to jobs? How is it designed and located in less risky areas? How does it involve residents in community management? How does it protect the security of residents, both from violence and from threats of displacement, the security of tenure, that is? How is the resilience of housing for low-income people a window into the politics of resilience at the city level? I think that's what most interested in. So one of the places that we looked at, and I cannot claim to be anything other than a visitor for a couple of weeks to this part of Indonesia in 2014. So 10 years after Banda Aceh in particular and some of the areas around it were so devastatingly destroyed by that tsunami in particular and the earthquake as well, we went back to really meet with people, working with some people at the Disaster and Tsunami Research Center at the university there in Banda Aceh, and they helped connect us with village leaders and allowed us to tour some of the reconstructed settlements. So 10 years after this, and so we were trying to figure out, well, what do our principles have to say for a situation like this? And I think we found 3 different types of approaches that had both strengths and weaknesses. And I suspect that there's some here that know far more about this than I do. And I would welcome further discussion, especially if anybody has some updates on these places. But they were very eager to show us Kampung Lambung, that was kind of a blank slate model village that was constructed in one of the most devastated places. This was a village of 5,000 people just outside of Banda Aceh, had 700 families living there, and there were 60 survivors after the tsunami. Most of them were fishermen that were out in their boats when the waves came through. And of course, initially the government said, do not rebuild within 2 kilometers of the shoreline. And this is what a fishing community was told. But of course they needed that. And so the solution here was to allow rebuilding by inventing essentially a new building type. The larger picture there is showing this ramped building that is a multi-story, very durable concrete ramp structure that is really called an escape building. In other words, people could evacuate vertically rather than horizontally, trying to outrun a tsunami, that kind of thing. And what it did is it provided all sorts of community center activities when there isn't a tsunami. A new center for the community. It had badminton courts, it had performance stage, a wedding venue, prayer area. And the other thing that happened was a shared governance about how to reblock the city, the village, and to figure out ways where people would give up a little bit of their land, but create a new kind of community, one that's now, at least when last I checked, about half the size of the pre-tsunami numbers. The second one that probably got the most international coverage was the Indonesia-China Friendship Village that was dedicated in 2007. It's more commonly referred to as the Jackie Chan Village because the Hong Kong movie star made a donation and paid a brief visit. And it's 300 meters above sea level, but 1.5 kilometers inland. So certainly it's beyond the reach of any future wave. Unfortunately, it seemed to be beyond the reach of any future job. And so it gave free houses to the former homeowners that were displaced by the tsunami, and some former renters got houses. 606 houses got built, 2,400 people. But 7 years later, when we visited, it had only 1,200 people in it. It's 17 kilometers from Banda Aceh, and the people that were living there were fishermen or becak drivers or traders or service workers or small-scale entrepreneurs who had resettled there and had inadequate public transport. There was no village market, no community input in any of this. And even worse, the farmers who gave up their land to build this also lost their livelihood on the hillsides. The third one, to my mind, perhaps the most successful, were these set of communities where community involvement was really stressed and local governance was highly valued. Right after the tsunami, the anti-poverty network Uplink Banda Aceh took a strong stance that the villagers should be encouraged to rebuild where they previously lived. And they managed to get 3,000 houses built, recreating village layouts, including the relationship with the mosque. They were building way before the other international organizations had even sorted out what to do. And the important thing to me was that they were treating physical rebuilding as a kind of entry point for capacity building, for self-determination, and really importantly, for psychological healing. The residents were managing the construction of their own homes. They were really interested, the UBA people were really interested in not just rebuilding housing, they were interested in rebuilding trust. They did things like art therapy programs and social events, and they were focused on restoring income generating opportunities. These are the kinds of things that I think are part of this more holistic approach to resilience that I'm describing. Meanwhile, organizations like the World Bank have typically built large projects on the outskirts of cities that often are culturally detached and too far out from people's needs. And what's been very interesting for me to see, starting in 2017, and then about a month ago, I've become more directly involved with this myself, was a concept that they started calling resilient housing for resilient cities. In other words, there was a growing recognition that it isn't enough just to build the house that's going to withstand physically some kind of traumatic event, but it's also going to try and do something for the larger city. In other words, it matters where you build it. It matters how you put things together, thinking about the larger resilience of the city, not simply the structural stability. There are a lot of challenges to do this. They're correct to note this, but the danger of building back too quickly, what Delaney and Schrader called the tyranny of the urgent. I like that phrase. The poor location of the housing, the mismanagement of money and logistics, the way that it gets disengaged from locals and miss local insights, the cultural misfit. One size fits all doesn't fit many circumstances. How is it that housing can be built in a way that enables livelihoods, those sorts of things? The fascinating thing to me is that there's no shortage of guiding principles that make lots of sense. The World Bank has been having these for more than a decade. They know what needs to be done. Reactivate communities, put owners in charge, effective organization structure, rethink the future, collaborate, engage civil society, 6 more, assess and monitor, policy reform, stabilize finances, avoid relocation if you can, or if you can't, then at least try and deal with what it means to relocate people. All of these kinds of things that are there. But the challenge of actually doing something about that, is really a matter of what I call the politics of resilience. So as I come towards the conclusion here, I think it's really important, again, to stress this question of whose resilience matters. Because cities are not uniform landscapes of randomly distributed persons, but are instead organized in ways that both produce and reflect underlying socioeconomic disparities, it usually makes no sense to describe an entire city as resilient. Almost every conceivable environmental perturbation is experienced differently within a city, depending on specific locational attributes that are all too often distributed in ways that situate those with the most socioeconomic vulnerability in the most physically vulnerable places. Experts often assert that the displacement from those kinds of vulnerable places is actually in the best interest of vulnerable residents, and they may be right some of the time at least, But that doesn't make it any easier on those who see others enthusiastically benefiting from the alternative investment that follows after their own forced departure. So ultimately, to me, whatever the cause, what we too easily call something called recovery is experienced in highly differentiated ways by different individuals and different social groups in different spatial locations. So this engineering vision of resilience, the bounce back ability, is still the dominant narrative promulgated by city leadership, but it's not necessarily the lived reality. The assertions of bounce back or the related idea of build back better seem to be more political necessities, almost to the point of cliche, but they can't really hide the decisions about who gets helped to bounce back first within cities that have different levels of wealth and power. So when the engineering metaphor for resilience is deployed, it's no longer a descriptor for anything that is in the nature of materials. Social resilience as a concept changes the metaphor because it involves efforts to create and manage a new and different socioeconomic system or socio-environmental system. It's just too easy to talk about bouncing back to where we were without asking which is the we that gets counted. So as long as citizens are insisting on a politically engaged form of resilience and they're asking these questions, whose resilience, whose city, the notion of resilient city can contribute usefully to efforts that are there. So if I would just conclude by saying what I hope is some kind of effort to achieve what would be not just a resilient city, but an equitably resilient city. The work that we're trying to do is to figure out how do you combine quality public space design, environmental protection, and social equity. How do we find and build a global database of places that are doing this so that a social equity lens is part of what it means to create resilient places. So this is what I mean by resilient urbanism. It emerges when there is a legitimate process that merges environmentally protective infrastructure and an attractive built environment to promote equitable habitation. Where it falls short is this issue of process and equity. And I think we need to think through how that actually plays out in places. There were 4 criteria laid out in a useful article by Neil Adger and colleagues in 2005 that dealt not just with the technical questions of effectiveness and efficiency. In other words, does an adaptation reduce vulnerability? Does it do so efficiently in terms of time and space and financial resources? That's where a lot of the focus on resilience has been. But the politics of adaptation, the questions of equity and legitimacy are the ones that matter. The environmental vulnerability is distributed so unevenly, and so many people that face the most acute exposure have the biggest challenges. And this is why resilient urbanism projects could sometimes inadvertently harm the poor rather than help if they're not part of these larger set of questions. Inequitably resilient urbanism legitimacy, in other words, who's deciding and how are the people who are most impacted part of that process, that may precede the judgments about equity, because the legitimacy is about judgment on the inclusiveness of the process itself, whereas equity may be judged only fully at the time of the outcome, the output of it. And so legitimacy, especially if we're talking about urbanism in service of climate adaptation, depends on engaging those who are most directly affected. Katrina had this legendarily problematic diagram that was called the green dot diagram, where the newspaper presented this map of the city showing potential parks in green space and ignored the kinds of people who suddenly found their own neighborhoods shown as a series of bold green dots. It was about fiscal responsibility and service delivery becoming more efficient and improved environmental protection through water retention and less burden on pumps. It was new opportunities for public space. And yet the problem was it quickly revealed its political limitations. It was not politically resilient. People objected that it was chosen by unelected and unaccountable people, and that the corrupt city government was denying their right to return. Some even called it a form of ethnic cleansing or class and racial redlining. So it failed completely. In Dhaka, on the other side of the planet, there's a famous project in the center of the city known as Hatterjeel that was touted as turning wasteland to waterland and restoring water urbanism, and was seen as a tremendously successful project by some people, but it really failed to do a lot of other things as well. It provided attractive and even spectacular new public space in an area that needed it. It did all of these things to improve traffic flow and hold stormwater and parkland, but at the same time, it failed on the legitimacy and equity grounds. The project was not resilient urbanism because it was illegitimate and inequitable. There was no consultation. It was largely constructed by the army. It displaced tens of thousands of informal settlers and permitted the illegal construction of an office tower by a powerful industry group. You can see the tower still in the heart of the project. So let me though conclude by just saying that I don't think this is completely impossible to find things that really do all of these things. A couple of examples follow. Even in New Orleans, that had all of its problems and had the contested green dot idea that implied neighborhood displacement. Another neighborhood, the Gentilly neighborhood, has its own resilience district, and it's an attempt to really help a predominantly African-American middle to working class neighborhood with green infrastructure, but also job training and all sorts of ways of helping people remain in their neighborhood. Another place that's quite famous is the work in Rotterdam in the Netherlands with this series of water squares to deal with flooding. This is the Bentham Plain Water Square. It's multifunctional stormwater retention space, but it's also a public plaza suitable for sitting and sports and programs. And it's in a comparatively lower income district that attracts a lot of diverse groups and did not entail displacement. It involved the local students in the design decision-making that were there. And the hope is that there will be examples like this more and more all over the world. The goal is to get to this point. Resilient urbanism, where there's an enthusiastic yes to the first questions, of course. Does the project reduce environmental vulnerability? Does the project produce quality public space? But also engaging the kinds of things that have too often not been part of the work of other projects. Does the project engage the community in a way that empowers rather than merely placates? And does the project benefit disadvantaged communities rather than harm or displace them? So I don't think it's impossible. It's difficult to do it. And I think we should be collecting and touting more examples of successful projects. So in the end, if we want to make cities and human settlements not just sustainable, but also inclusive, safe, and resilient, this means that we need to think about distributional politics. If we can move beyond the generality of the resilient city to embrace what I'm calling the equitably resilient city, then I think we do have a chance to make the SDG 11 serve cities and human settlements, not just for some, but for all. I'm happy to engage in
Thank you, Professor.
conversation and questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Phil. It's very interesting and giving insight, very good insight for us about resilient city. And we can see that the view of resilience in the politics for the resilient city. Well, I have here some question, but perhaps I can divide it into 3 sessions. First, I will read some question here that I have in what is it, YouTube, and some from the chat. But unfortunately, I out from the internet because it then the question was is the question in the chat was all missing, but I have it from the YouTube. I will read it 2 or 3 first for the first session, then the answer, and then I'm waiting from other question if you have. If yeah, so there's a question here. I will read it for you, Larry, from. Where is it? Well, there's a question. Unlike in post-earthquake or fire or tsunami disasters, the post-COVID cities actually don't experience any physical destruction. In this case, then what could be built back better be like? First, and the second question I have here is well, there is from the undergraduate from architecture, but I think that's a good question. Are toxic narrative important to voice when the government perform poorly in disasters and try to use narrative of progress and redemption to get away? And the third is oops. What if one of them doesn't go well? What is it? That's the I don't get it. Relay opportunities to rebuild a better system and urban environment of the cities are affected. Oh, what is your stance in this statement, and how should we approach the said opportunities for us to seize? So I think there are there's 3 questions.
I'm not sure that I'm following the core of the third one.
The third and how should we approach opportunity for us to seize? Should we approach the said opportunity for us to seize? I think is it the opportunity have to be seized rather than we waiting for them to come after the disaster.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So those are really interesting questions. I mean, the COVID-19 post-COVID-19 city is a a really pressing question right now. I mean, I think it is true that that this is not the destruction of a city, but one of the things that COVID-19 seems to be doing all over the planet is clarifying which kinds of living conditions make it harder for people to avoid close contact with others and vulnerability to the disease. And so I think there are some questions about overcrowding and other kinds of challenges that are being addressed or revealed, whether in the United States or in developing countries, about which neighborhoods and which kinds of situations are there, because it's the same pattern of people who are least advantaged in other dimensions becoming more vulnerable to COVID-19. So the hope is that some of the same kinds of efforts to intervene in neighborhoods without displacing people can apply to making a neighborhood more resilient to a future pandemic, as well as a future other kinds of disasters. So on the one hand, I think these things really are quite different because of the lack of physical destruction, but the thing that they share in common are disasters that reveal the underlying vulnerability and the differential vulnerability that existed before the crisis. And so it's another reminder of just how important it is to do that. In terms of the narratives and the sense of the toxic narrative of being suppressed in favor of the narratives about progress and building back better, I think there is good reason for people to push back and to say, you know, you have failed as a government in your principal responsibility, which is to keep us safe. And this is the lesson I take from the Mexico City 1985 earthquake, for instance, is that there really was a sense of people saying, no, you can't just kind of tell us we're going to stabilize international currencies and all is well. And but no, you need to deal with the people who suffered most, and you need to understand that our lives have been totally disruptive. Otherwise, we will vote you out of power. So I think that there is a place for the voices of people to come back, and I hope that there will be good examples for that. And similarly, this question of opportunity that happens, it's a fine line between opportunity and opportunism. In other words, people frequently say, don't let a good disaster go to waste. A kind of weird sentence, but the idea is that some things that people have wanted to do now become possible because there's a new reason or an added reason to do something. That's true, but it also is the case that people can all too easily use that as an excuse to do something that is in a very self-interested measure, not something that has a broad set of gains for the broader society. And so that the opportunism, what Naomi Klein has called disaster capitalism, is a big problem. And the challenge is for a lot of people to have their voice heard in trying to determine priorities, so that the kinds of things that are jumped at in an immediate disaster moment are not simply those that narrowly benefit particular industries and particular individuals, but are seen as having a much broader value to the society, where there is some voice in those decision kinds of making things. And so I think opportunity is tempered by opportunism, and one has to be always on the outlook for which it is.
Okay, thank you. And it seems that COVID is still in the trend of the question. There's another for the second session. I will read the three also question. One here is that there has been more exposure on the disparities between lower working class and middle upper class of COVID-19 in Jakarta, and I think also in the United States. There has been an uproar about people, mainly server, cinema worker, etc., opening up places and going back to work. And this uproar are coming from middle and upper class, people who mostly has been able to work from home and largely unaffected by the pandemic. In this case, we can see from both point of view, there are workers who pay daily and they don't work. They can put food in the table, but the state of economy is also declining. But the middle upper class also see that endangering more lives. How do we balance between this different point of view? This is the first. The second, well, that how to regulate urban transportation system with existing condition. Again, I think this in relation with COVID. And urban system is no longer irregular. What are the top priority points to improve? Well, there is dilemma in Jakarta, for instance. If you go into, if you give all these people going with the public transportation is not enough. So they will give the for the private transportation, but private transportation make it traffic jam everywhere and just for the COVID-19. Then what is the risk here? I think there's also the second question. The third question, I think with the agglomeration. Would you explain a little bit about resiliency in urban agglomeration context? It could be great to share about resiliency in urban agglomeration context, particularly in infrastructure system. Yeah, I think that's the three questions that we have for the second session. Please.
Yeah. Well, I mean, these are all they're questions, but they're really dilemmas, meaning that they're better phrased as questions than I can give you as answers. You know, I think the question of the, you know, I think the demonstrable fact that some people's lives and livelihoods are more disrupted and putting them at greater risk of catching the virus in lower income groups and in certain occupations compared to those who are able to work from home and have a place where they can work from home, where they have a stable internet connection, where the nature of the work that they do is transferable, where, like me, sitting in my home office means I don't need to go into my MIT office. You know, it means that I can talk to you in a situation like this. That's underscoring a level of privilege and differentiation that is, you know, deeply rooted and deeply revealed by this kind of challenge. I think that the key thing in having some kind of balance of attention to this is to have as frequent a set of reminders to people on the side of life going on as per usual to some extent, that is completely impossible on the one hand, and that their life per usual is entirely dependent on people risking their lives in other parts of the economy. And this is the kind of problem that happens in lots of countries. So, in the United States, the government will point to the stock market at near record highs, and because the tech companies are doing just fine and their workers are working it remotely and things like that. And meanwhile, it bears no relationship to the unemployment and the nature of the loss of jobs and livelihoods for many other people. And if you allow only one side of that story to be told, then you fail to balance those things. And if you fail to balance those things, you're not going to pay attention to the people that have suffered the most. The transportation problem is not one that I have looked at. My last visit to Jakarta was on the election day in 2014. That was a holiday, and there were remarkably little traffic. So my last exposure to Jakarta was on a very unusual day. But I, did get to see, some of the transportation infrastructure and heard many stories about how it would be if I were there on a normal day. And I think this is a problem all over the world, is that, and it's not unrelated to that first question, is the people, if you're going to have an overcrowded public transportation system that is unsafe, and then you're asking people or forcing people, if they can, to be in private vehicles in the context of these rideshare systems and other vehicles, there is not a good solution. The public systems that are already operating at a maximum capacity, whether before this, are going to have to return in some way that, at least temporarily, has lower occupancy, and then the only solution to me is to have some people more of the time not spending their time commuting in any way, and to make plans for how to reorganize where people work from for those that can, and then try and make it safer for those that cannot afford to work from home to do so. And it's quite remarkable. But sometimes behavioral things would do. There was an experiment at MIT a few years ago where they needed to build a new building, and there was a surface parking garage, and nobody wanted to take the parking down until somebody said, well, what if you put a transit pass on the ID card and encourage people to use that for free, and it reduced the amount of people using cars by enough to tear down the parking lot and build a dormitory instead. And that's a privileged version of this problem, but it's there. In terms of infrastructure and agglomeration and all of that, I mean, I think it is right to think about these as city regional challenges, that this has to be one of the things where we really tackle the problem, looking at the broader patterns of movement, looking at incentives for people to live beyond the densest areas, looking for ways of reducing the need to move on a daily basis between two places in a crowded region. But it's not one that I have focused much on myself, but it's a key problem.
Okay, Professor Phil. Actually, the time is 2017 now, but I think if you don't mind, we can have another session for 3 other questions, which I think is back to the resilience. Thank you. So this question: is resilience a state of situation that have to be assessed routinely, and in what way what kind of narratives have you recognized when private sector use the term resilience? Yeah, I think that's the first question. And then I think that's the first. Yeah, I think that's a question. What, other question? Or what kind of resilience approach with fit with the current circumstances impacted by COVID, which mostly physiological affected the community than physical? I think almost the same with the first question of city result on the new normal. What kind of a new normal is it? I think I will stay there. Two questions to be answered, please.
Yeah. I mean, I think this question of how does one assess resilience and what does one make of the ways that the private sector uses the term is a really important aspect, and it's what I was trying to get at the beginning, where I was saying that, you know, when we talk about what the city is and who the city is, we mean lots of different things, and the number of businesses that take up this word resilience and mean it in a very different way is, I think, one of the most important aspects. You know, the sense of resilience means, can I stay in business no matter what shock hits the system? How do I have redundancies? How do I have ways of communicating? How do I ensure my supply chain? All of those kinds of things. It's a very much focused on the abounded entity being more aware of how it is vulnerable to a larger system. That's a really important aspect, but it runs the risk of seeing resilience as a matter of supply chain management and losing sight of the different people and job responsibilities and networks that are part of that supply chain that are often at high risk. And so, you know, certainly I think it's a perfectly acceptable use of the term resilience, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the interests of getting and sustaining a business are necessarily the same set of interests as sustaining a community, particularly a low-income community. And so it can get to that point where it's not only about sustaining the operations of a necessary industry, which is of course crucial, but into this other mode of opportunism and profiteering and trying to gain a set of privileges and contracts that result from a disaster. That's the part of it that I think needs to be very carefully managed and monitored. On this question of the psychological aspects of resilience, I think that was one of the most interesting things to me during my brief stay in Banda Aceh, was the extent to which the researchers of the following the tsunami, and they were already 10 years into their work, did not want to talk about the economy. They did not want to talk about the strength of building materials. They wanted to talk about the human strength of people who were dealing with the tremendous loss of their loved ones 10 years later. The sense that this was a deeply personal and psychological kind of crisis that that was what I would describe as part of the emotional resilience of that. And it's a reminder that, you know, that we get this term resilience from all of these fields. In many ways, the field of psychology was ahead of all of them. You know, by the middle of the 20th century, people were talking about what makes a resilient individual. Why are some people able to overcome crises much better than others? What is it about them as people, as persons? And then you get the engineering bounce back ability kind of work, and then you get the ecologists that are looking at that ecosystems since the 1970s. But I, you know, one of the reasons that I argue for trying to keep all of these fields together rather than just see it as a kind of chaotic concept is that I think the psychologists need to be talking to the engineers and the engineers need to be talking to the ecologists. And if we can see these challenges as challenges of ecosystems and human systems and engineering systems, then we're closer to modeling the problem in its totality and closer to having the empathy that is needed to address this kind of really important set of challenges, whether it's COVID-19 or climate change or any of the other challenges of a deeply unequal set of cities and settlements as we move forward to address the challenges of the SDG 11 and other goals. We only get there if we think holistically, and not just holistically, but analytically within that holistic approach.
Thank you, Professor Phil. I think the time is 2024 here now. It's but it's in the morning there. But I think before we close this, I think there's a takeaway from here that I want to share with you all. But I think there are three important things. The first is that when we look at the resilience, we have to see who get the resilience and whose city is it. So, and there we can see this political view of this resilience when what you call the balance between the community and the system has to be taken into account. And here also ecosystem and human and engineering have to be looked at holistic, so that then we can see the resilience in a more holistic way for the city for all. I think that's the takeaway that we can have from Larry today. There's a lot of things, but I think that's the thing that we can talk about this. Thank you, Larry. I think we have to finish this. I don't know whether should I give it back to Dean, Mariati. But yes, I think we have a very good insight from Professor Vale. And please, if you may, you can have a big applause to Professor Relly.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I hope I can see you in person sometime soon.
Yeah.
Thank you
Okay,
very much.
Ibu Dekan, Budin, Sri Mariati, if you have something to say. Thank you very much, Larry, and I hope that I can see you also in person in MIT next year, or I don't know, in the futures. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Pak Haryo, and thank you very much, Professor. Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Larry Vale. This is a very insightful lecture. And also, as you know, this is the inaugural lecture for this semester in our school, and also for inaugural lecture for our online seminar series is about sustainable development goals. And maybe this is important to inform you that this lecture was watched by nearly 500 participants from Zoom and also from YouTube channel. Yes, and again, thank you very much. I hope that the collaboration between ITB and MIT can be further developed for the future. And also, we hope that sometimes we can meet. This is under the pandemic. It's a very limited opportunity to have to meet physically, but of course we hope that sometimes maybe next year we can meet again physically. Yes, thank you, Professor Phil. And with this, I will also close this lecture. And thank you also for all of the participants, Pak Haryo, Pak Delik, who also initiate this guest lecture from Professor Larry Vail, Pak Aswin, who prepared the technical things of this occasion, and also all of the teams. Yes, thank you very much, and see you again.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you all.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Very interesting.